Today is Sunday, February 19th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This morning, I received an email from a visitor to the Academy website, and he asked me if the Chesterton Academy was a classical school, if it is offering true classical education. And I get this sort of question all the time. Is such and such school or such and such academy a classical school? And my answer is always the same, and I believe this answer is all over the Academy website. There's a very simple way to test whether any program is a true classical program or not. It's very, very simple. And the test is this: does a certain school or homeschool program teach the 7 liberal arts, and does it prepare students to study scholastic philosophy? That's what classical Catholic education is. Classical Catholic education, very simply, teaches children the 7 classical liberal arts and prepares them to study scholastic philosophy. So anytime that there is a school or a program that anyone is questioning, you can simply look at the curriculum for the school, if they even have one. Many schools like to make no commitment to any curriculum. But if they do publish their curriculum, simply look at the curriculum and see whether they lead children in the study of the master texts of the classical liberal arts, and whether they prepare children for the study of scholastic philosophy, which is the philosophy of the Catholic Church, established by St. Thomas Aquinas and others back in the 12th and 13th centuries. Now the problem, which I wrote about in a short article after Mass today, is that most Catholic parents living today think like common people. They may have college degrees, they may have desk jobs, they may have professional titles, but they have the intellectual formation of peasants. And I don't say this in a way to embarrass anyone or even to criticize anyone. It's just a fact that we have to acknowledge. It's like, to begin the Christian life, one has to acknowledge that he is fallen. He's in sin. He's dead in transgressions and sins. And that realization, that acknowledgement of one's condition, is the starting point for the Christian life. The Proverbs teach that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And similarly, in academics, Socrates' famous acknowledgement that he knows nothing is the beginning of true learning. And we've got to understand that in this generation, more than any generation in a long time, and increasingly so, we have lots of information, but we know nothing. And our neglect of true classical studies has left us with the mind of medieval peasants. And yet we're in a worse condition than the medieval peasants, because the medieval peasants lived in a society that was governed by kings and church leaders who were informed by true religion and philosophy. And in our society, we don't have that. It's every man for himself. It's a gross and terrible society to live in. That's becoming increasingly gross and terrible because the foolishness of democracy is working itself out one generation at a time. And we've been born into this ignorant, self-destroying society, and we don't know how to think. We don't know how to study. We don't know what we should study or how to study it. And the only hope that we have of fixing this, not socially, but individually, is to acknowledge that we're lost intellectually, and we need to get back on the right road and start from the beginning, whether we're 12 years old or 50 years old. We're either going to turn against this ignorant modern culture and go back to the wisdom of the ancients, or we're going to go on in this foolish democratic society where every man thinks he's a king, and the society just continues to degenerate and self-destruct. Now, in modern society, in democratic society, we have a division of people into two parties. We have one party that is referred to as liberals, and another party that's referred to as conservatives. And in most circles, in most institutions, the liberals are more numerous. They're more influential. They have greater control. This is true of colleges and universities. This is true in government offices. This is true in business. This is true in many churches. It's true in many places. Some imagine that it's true in the mass media, in the entertainment industry, and so on. But the liberal side of things tends to be more numerous and therefore more influential. And the people who belong to the opposite party, the so-called conservatives, they tend to resist this liberal influence by retreating and by trying to form their own private institutions and organizations that promote their political ideals, these conservative political ideals. And one of their focal points is on education. And so they pull their kids out of the so-called liberal schools, and they choose to send them to local conservative schools, or they choose to homeschool, where they can teach their conservative values to their children, or they even organize their own conservative schools. But what's strange is when it comes to academics, the conservatives are embarrassed to refer to their schools as conservative schools, even though that's what they are. They're simply schools by which the political views of the conservative Americans are promoted among children. That's all that they are. These schools are instruments by which politically conservative Americans promote their political views among children. The schools are entirely political. The character of the school is political. The message of the school is political. The focus of the school is political. And they represent the conservative political party. But like I said, the conservatives seem to be embarrassed to admit such to be true. They don't call their schools conservative schools. They've chosen, for some bizarre reason that I cannot figure out, they've chosen to call these schools classical schools. They refer to the education that they give their children as classical education. And they decorate the schools, the books, the websites, the marketing materials, and so on. They decorate everything with images of saints, of famous Greeks and Romans, of Jewish patriarchs and prophets and apostles, images of Greece and Rome, and so on. And they refer to these schools, like I said, as classical schools. They refer to this education that they offer as classical education. And it's no such thing. It has nothing to do with classical education. It is American, politically conservative education. That's all that it is. And yet, they seem to be embarrassed to admit that that's what their schools are. And so they try to pretend like it's something more, like it's a more substantial educational philosophy than it is. They try to pretend like it has some deeper meaning, some more ancient origin, some more profound philosophy behind it, that it's not just a place where a political worldview is taught to a younger generation. They want to appear like they're doing something more than merely passing their political views on to children. But that's what these schools are for. They're conservative, party politics school programs that are intended to raise politically conservative Americans. And if you just think about the focus of these schools, you'll see that what I say is true. If we were to identify the essential qualities of these falsely named classical schools, we would see that they really have nothing to do with philosophy. They really have nothing to do with classical studies or the classical liberal arts. They're all about a handful of political ideas. First of all, they claim to promote or preserve what they call Western civilization. They talk about Western civilization. They don't define Western civilization, but they talk about Western civilization as if it's some kind of code word for a culture that everyone understands. But Western civilization would include ancient Israel. It would include Greece and Rome. It would include medieval Europe. It would include the British Empire and British culture. And even if we look within that history, we find that these peoples and nations all fought against each other and opposed each other. There was no unanimous thing ever known as Western civilization, any more than there was any Greek nation during ancient Greek times. Athens and Sparta destroyed each other. So when we talk about Western civilization, we have to figure out what in the world anyone actually means, because the different members of European history opposed and fought against each other constantly. Does Western civilization, for example, include both Aristotelianism and Epicureanism? They're both Western philosophies. Does it include the writings of both Seneca and Catullus? They're both Western writers. Does it include both Aristotelian natural philosophy and Darwinian evolution? They're both Western ideas. Does it include both Judaism and Christianity and Islam? They're all Western religions. So what would Western civilization really be? While claiming to be concerned with something called Western civilization, it's clear that this is just a code word for a Eurocentric American culture. They refer to it as Western civilization. But what it really is a European American culture. They refer to the works to be studied as the so-called great books. But who determines what books are in this list of great books? The authors are selected quite randomly. They include Aristotle, Plato, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, but they'll also include Lucretius. They'll also include Francis Bacon. They may include Desiderius Erasmus and Thomas More. But they may also include men who were their opponents in medieval Europe. They may include Dante and Thomas Aquinas, but they'll also include John Locke and Adam Smith. There's no real principle to this collection of the great books, which reveals that it really isn't, again, about any kind of Western civilization or any actual philosophical tradition. It's just a code word for picking and choosing from a controversial and constantly divided European civilization, and using that as a cover for a very specific political platform. And so the first topic they talk about is Western civilization, but as I said, there's no real way to identify what they're talking about. And how many of them have actually studied any of that history before they act as if they already know what's to be preserved in it? So that's the first mark of this conservative political education. They use terms like Western civilization vaguely, without distinguishing what exactly that would mean. Secondly, they are concerned with preserving what they consider to be the Christian American founding. They promote this idea that America was founded by Christians, that America was intended to be a Christian nation, and that the founding fathers were models of virtuous Christian men. And so today we need to fight for the American Christian origin. And they imagine that every religion that exists in America that is not Christian is a threat to the original Christian culture of America. They see America as some sort of city on a hill. They see America as the New Jerusalem. It's the New Zion. America is God's chosen nation on earth. Its laws are said to be Christian laws, its founders to be Christian men. Its culture is suggested to be Christian culture, and the liberals are said to be seeking to destroy Christian America. And so the children are taught that they've got to grow up, learn about the Christian founding, and fight for Christian America. And there's this sort of legendary, mythological narrative of the origin of the United States of America. So the defense of Christian America is a second quality of these schools. You'll see that there is a heavy emphasis on colonial America, on the founding fathers, on the Constitution, with a specific interpretation. They'll argue that we can only read the Constitution through the eyes of the Christian founders, and that it's restricted by the quote-unquote original intent of the founding fathers. So this Christian American founding is another characteristic. Thirdly, they'll argue for capitalism and oppose socialism. They will argue that capitalism is American, capitalism is true, capitalism is necessary, and that socialism or communism is evil. And again, these things are never defined or made clear. For example, what exactly is meant by capitalism? Does capitalism mean a completely free market? Most of the people talking about capitalism wouldn't have jobs if a free market was actually in place. Most of the people talking about free market capitalism wouldn't have been able to go to college, wouldn't have health care, wouldn't be able to travel, on and on, because they live dependent on a multitude of socialized services. And yet there's talk about free market capitalism as a third pillar of this conservative political worldview, fighting against socialism and communism, and they define just about any political program initiated by their political rivals as socialist. Anytime liberals approve a plan for the government to do something, it's labeled as socialism or an attempt to destroy American capitalism. But anytime that conservative politicians promote a large state-funded socialized program, it's considered to be perfectly fine within capitalism. And so this anti-socialist message is a third pillar of this conservative political worldview that these so-called classical schools exist to promote. Then they get into the pro-life movement, which is always a focus for a number of reasons. And abortion is presented as the ultimate evil, and the children are encouraged to get involved in fighting against the so-called pro-choice movement, and this becomes a focus of these schools, with the March of Life being sort of the annual convention where every school's commitment to the mission is challenged and put to the test. If you're a member of this conservative American movement, you've got to represent. And so the abortion crisis, the abortion debate, which is a very complicated issue, is split into party politics, and these schools promote the so-called pro-life movement as a necessary moral duty of all of the children in these schools. Another key topic is the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. As we watch school shootings and violence increase in America, there's this argument that the American people have a right to bear arms, that civilians have a right to carry any weapons they please, because they have to arm themselves against a tyrannical government. And this idea of fighting against the government is promoted in these schools. The government is taught to be a living threat to the conservative people, and the children are taught that they need to fight against the government. The government is presented as the bad guy, and we need to be willing to fight against the bad guy, against the government. And so the present government is said to be tyrannical and corrupt. Everything is accomplished through corruption and tyranny. If they win an election, it's said to be rigged. Anything they do is said to be done by deceit and fraud and oppression. And again, they turn back to the American colonies for an example of the spirit of revolution, this standing militia society that's constantly ready for a civil war to break out. And they promote this idea of fighting against the government in these conservative schools, while also maintaining a position that says that they are committed to law and order. They'll do things like pledge allegiance to the flag, talk about respect for their country, patriotism. They'll refer to themselves as patriots. There will be American flags everywhere as symbols of patriotism, and yet they commonly teach that the actual leaders, the actual government institutions of this country are evil. The FBI is evil, the CIA is evil, the Congress is evil, the president is evil, the courts are evil. Every part of this actual living American government is said to be corrupt and tyrannical, and therefore there's always this talk about the need to be willing to fight against your government. And this fight against the government is symbolized, as it were, by the Second Amendment, which is quite ridiculous. But that's a different subject. Now, when we see that the Catholic Church doesn't embrace this political movement. It doesn't embrace the message of this political movement. It doesn't think with the pessimistic, escapist mindset of this conservative political crowd. The Catholic Church is very easily identified as another traitor, as another compromised opponent. And Catholics who are wrapped up in this conservative political crowd will have no problem criticizing and making accusations against the Pope and bishops, just as they do against the government of their own country. And so there's not only a separation from government authority, but there's also a ready separation from church authority in these circles. And we very commonly find them wrapped up not only in conservative American politics, but also in the so-called traditional Catholicism, which identifies simply as a rebellion against the living hierarchy of the Church. So we can look at this list of platform issues, and these really characterize the mission and culture of these schools. They have nothing to do with ancient Israel or with classical Greece or Rome. They have nothing to do with medieval Europe. Nothing to do really with anything in Western history before the American Revolution. And what's important for us to acknowledge, again, as Catholics, is that this American fantasy is not a Catholic movement. It's not a Catholic idea. And if we look at those key platform issues, we'll find that they're shared by Catholics and by Protestants, by many Jews and by even Muslims. And they have very little to do with Christianity at all. And the Catholic Church is not in that camp. This should be a red flag to Catholics, but it's not. And again, going back to what I said at the beginning, it's because in this democratic society, the American people have the intellect of peasants without the benefit of the government of wise men. Everything is a matter of democratic politics. Everything comes down to numbers and popular influence. And Catholics get swept up in all of this democratic American frenzy, just like anyone else does. And rather than seeing themselves as missionaries sent by Christ into the world to make Christian disciples, that all men might be saved and come to the knowledge of God, they spend their lives fighting against their neighbors in the name of Christian politics or conservative politics. And this whole system of conservative political action has become a justification to throw away the moral teaching of Christ and the mission of the Catholic Church. Today at Mass, providentially, we read Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And when you hear this teaching, it becomes obvious that it's the opposite of the message of the conservative political crowd. And that's no problem, because they've got answers prepared for how they'll explain away Jesus' words. And by the time they're finished, they'll say exactly the opposite of what Jesus said and suggest that that's what Jesus actually meant. So when Jesus says, for an example, "You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," when we look to the conservative political message, we find exactly that. We find them preaching eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth politics. we find that that's exactly their message. They're arguing for the death penalty. They're arguing for the right to bear arms so they can shoot and kill people who break into their houses. They're arguing for strict punishments for criminals and so on. And they have no problem arguing for strict political justice, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, while they read Jesus say that we ought not to argue for this strict political justice in the world because it's impossible. I often ask people who argue for the criminalization of abortion, I ask, have you thought about how criminalized abortion would be enforced by a government? If abortion is made to be illegal, and we already know that abortion is immoral, but immorality and illegality are two very different things, because illegality has to be enforced by punishments. If abortion is made illegal, how would that be enforced? Just try to think through that. Because it never seems that the people arguing for the criminalization of abortion have taken any time to think about how that crime would be enforced. Every miscarriage would have to be investigated as a potential murder. Every miscarriage. It would be, imagine if a 4-year-old child dies. Is there not an investigation to make sure that the child wasn't killed or his death wasn't caused by neglect? Every miscarriage would have to be investigated as a potential murder. Accusations could be made against women that they actually intended to end their pregnancy, and then women would have to go to court and defend themselves against accusations that their miscarriages were actually abortions. How would that be enforced? What would the penalties be? Would women who have abortions be sent to prison? How would that actually work? And you'll see when you ask those questions, you get an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth response from Christian people. And again, they have no difficulty in pretending that this aligns perfectly with Jesus' teaching. Jesus said, give no resistance to evil. If they ask to sue you over your tunic, give them your cloak also. St. Paul said, why do you go to courts with one another? And he says this, why not rather be wronged? And we see this Christian mentality where the Christians are concerned not with winning their lawsuits and getting their money from their neighbors, but they're concerned about the salvation of their neighbors, about the progress of the gospel, about the growth of the church. We see that there's a clear division and that these groups are headed in two opposite directions in society. And that's why it's very important to understand that these people wrapped up in conservative American politics, they're promoting a system of education that is simply pushing their political ideals among their children. They're propaganda machines for conservative politics in a democratic society. And you'll notice that if one of the children of these families doesn't embrace the conservative political platform, they'll be treated as if they're lost souls, as if they're publicans and tax collectors. And that's why this crowd has a very difficult time parenting, because if the children move out of their very rigid, narrow restrictions of their conservative political positions, they have no way of dealing with those kids. They don't embrace their children with the breadth of Christian love and mercy. They don't preach the gospel to their children. They will cut ties with a child who doesn't support the cause. And it becomes very clear that you either embrace the conservative political worldview or you need to go away. And it has very little to do with the salvation of souls at all. It's funny to think of what such people would do if the saints that we read about in history actually did what they did in the presence of this conservative American Christian society. What would they do when St. Francis stripped naked and renounced all of his father's possession? Where does that fit into the American Conservative Party platform? When St. Rose of Lima cut all her hair off to make herself look unattractive in protest against her parents' desire for her to get married, would Rose of Lima have fit within one of these conservative Christian schools? You can see the saints wouldn't have fit in to this narrow-minded and shallow political school culture. When Augustine was going through his rebellious teenage years, he would have been written off as a lost soul. Thankfully, St. Monica didn't think like a conservative political American. And so we see there's a clear division between true Catholicism, which is very broad and profound, and this shallow, narrow American conservative political worldview. True classical education embraces true Catholicism. True classical education is broad and profound. Unlike the conservative message, which another of the qualities is that it's focused on what it calls traditional family values, marriage, and gender roles, which is why it's so stirred up by this modern popularity of transgender issues and all of this stuff without realizing that it's partly the cause of this crisis and not the solution. But it's got this Protestantish obsession with what it calls traditional marriage and family life and gender roles, and it doesn't leave room for religious vocations. It doesn't leave room for celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The education that's offered to the children doesn't educate them with a view that they may choose to not marry and not work and not enter into secular life, but may choose to separate from it entirely and devote their life to religion. The curriculum in the school doesn't provide for that option. Because the conservative political school program is entirely temporal and materialistic. That's why, if anything does make it into the curriculum, there's a temporal, practical, materialistic explanation for why it's allowed into the curriculum. And if it doesn't help with temporal or political ambitions, it's not seen as relevant or necessary. This is why the classical liberal arts are not taught in these conservative schools. They may have a Latin class, but they can't really explain why American children living in the 21st century need to study Latin, and so they barely study Latin. They'll study a program like Lingua Latina, where you just sort of dabble with some Latin. They won't study the art of grammar in Latin because they'll consider that to be a waste of time, because they're not interested in the actual arts of a philosophical education. And yet they insist on retaining some kind of appearance of being so. So they will have Latin in the curriculum, even though they'll only pursue it in a superficial way. They won't pursue the classical quadrivium. They'll simply replace it with modern materialistic, practical mathematics that are required for a high school diploma or college admission. They have no real interest in the classical mathematical sciences, which make up 4/7, more than half of the classical curriculum. They have no interest in it. They'll simply stick modern math courses in the classical school. Because again, there's no real philosophical foundation or aim of these schools. So they'll have some English grammar maybe. They'll have some Latin, but they won't have the actual art of grammar studied and taught. They'll have a logic class, but if you look, it'll be a very shallow study of an oversimplified idea of what logic is. And they'll imagine that they are the logical people and the liberals are illogical, even though neither the liberals nor the conservatives actually make the effort or invest the time in studying the actual arts of classical reasoning, which is an incredibly difficult study that takes many years. And yet, because they add a course that they call logic, they'll actually puff themselves up and tell the children, we're not like the liberals, we study logic. Even though the truth is, they're not studying the arts of reasoning. They're studying their own books on the subject. And rhetoric, instead of actually studying the art of rhetoric, because they can't, since they haven't studied the arts of grammar or reasoning, they'll simply dilute rhetoric into public speaking, or classes that they call debate class, even though the debate class follows the rules of modern debate club activity and not anything historical at all. They'll water down rhetoric into public speaking, which is exactly what Aristotle says in his Art of Rhetoric is not the art of rhetoric. And so what's misleading about these conservative schools is that they will retain the words from history. They will retain an appearance of some deeper, more serious mission. And that's what's quite deceiving about all of it. It's deceiving because these appearances are retained when the substance and purpose of the education is rejected. And when we start to get into the real classical liberal arts, and we see the depth and difficulty of those studies, people will start to protest from the conservative camp. And they'll begin to ask utilitarian questions like, well, how are we going to use this? Why is this necessary? How is this going to help the kids? Is this necessary for college? And so on. The studies of the school, even though it claims to be classical, will be subject to modern practical concerns, anxieties about what we shall eat, what we shall drink, what we shall wear, how will we make a living, where will we go to college, and so on. All of the things that Christ said that we should not be concerned with. And yet they're insistent that it's a Christian program. The studies of the true classical curriculum are pursued for lifelong contemplation, for religious vocations, for philosophical vocations, for intellectual vocations, for lifelong devotion to learning, to literature, to philosophy, to religion, and so on. But really, these have no place in the conservative political school. And we don't find these subjects in the conservative school curriculum. For all the talk about classical education, we find none of the 4 arts of the quadrivium and only shallow counterfeits of the 3 arts of the trivium. So of the 7 arts of the classical curriculum, we find only counterfeit, shallow imitations of 3 of the 7. 4 are just completely neglected altogether. These classical studies are replaced with modern mathematics and modern science classes. There's no philosophy, no ancient philosophy. And if there is a philosophy course, it's simply a survey of the history of philosophy. It's an encyclopedic study of what philosophers have said through history. It's trivia show philosophy class. It's Google education. It's not an actual study of the philosophical sciences themselves. It's not a study of natural philosophy for the scientific knowledge of natural philosophy. It's not a study of metaphysics, not a study of rational philosophy, which is reasoning. It's a study about the history of philosophers and what the different philosophers said for the sake of trivia, or for the sake of saying, he's right, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's right, where the teacher, by not being accountable to the actual writings of the philosophers, is able to tell the students what the different philosophers said, is able to pull quotes and present the students with pieces of what the philosopher said, to give the children a distorted worldview where they imagine that the ancient philosophers taught conservative American ideas. And you can see that it's just propaganda. It's not real philosophical study. And what's worse for these kids is that these kids, when they're 17, 18, 19 years old, go out into a world imagining that they actually know the ancient philosophers. And you can see how they're just set up to misrepresent ancient philosophy, and they're set up to make fools of themselves. And they often move from the conservative school to a conservative college that pretends to serve the purpose of a university, which is to actually expose students to a diverse student body where they actually interact with people who represent all of these different groups in our society, where they get to have discussions about Islam with Muslims, and about Judaism with Jews, and about atheism with atheists, and about liberal ideas with liberals. We rarely find that, for all the talk of love of freedom, love of debate, love of free thinking, and so on, we rarely find conservatives who are willing to enter into diverse environments. And this is part of the whole problem. This is what reveals that it's really not a sincere interest in democracy or freedom or truth or debate. It's simply political propaganda. And this is really what these conservative schools are about. When they do get into Catholic culture, normally it's because they are reading textbooks about philosophy or theology. It's because they're reading Catholic authors like Tolkien or G.K. Chesterton. They're not actually entering into the studies that the saints studied. They're not entering into the studies that Thomas Aquinas was raised studying. They're not entering into the studies that the Jesuits promoted in their schools in the 15 and 1600s. They're not studying what the Dominicans like St. Albert the Great and St. Dominic himself studied in medieval Europe. They're not interested in those studies because those were spiritually minded, heavenly minded, eternity minded Christian studies. They weren't political studies. And yet, to keep up with this fake image of profundity and antiquity and some kind of universality of their views, they choose to call their schools classical schools to make an appearance of some kind of timeless and trustworthy significance, which they don't actually possess. And so it's unfortunate that these conservative Christian people have chosen to start schools and publish homeschool programs that they call classical education, when what they should be called, and what I ask Christians to call them out of honesty, is conservative education. It's not classical education. It's simply conservative education that does not make sense outside of an American political environment. Let's call it what it truly is. It's conservative political education. It is not classical Catholic education.